Hello, my friends. This is Dr. Deepak Chopra, and we're continuing our conversations with influencers, luminaries, sages, scientists, philosophers, psychotics. We're a motley group here, looking at reality from a different perspective. And today it's my great privilege, honor to bring into this conversation somebody who I've admired from a distance for decades, actually. He's also a common friend of a lot of common friends. But more importantly, I think he's the preeminent number one expert in the world on, guess what? Mushrooms. And I'm holding this book in my hand called Fantastic Fungi, How Mushrooms Can Heal, Shift Consciousness, and Save the Planet. The editor and contributor here is our friend Paul, who's joining us now. We have a lot to cover, and I'm very grateful that he's here with us. We'll be reaching millions of people with this conversation, so hopefully this will inspire you and friends of yours to look into this amazing work that Paul Stamets has done for us, for the world, and for science and for consciousness. So Paul, I had the occasion to actually meet, what's his name, Louis Schwartzberg, and I think he's done a good job with your help in this book. And I'd just like to start by first thanking you, but also for our audience who may not know you or your work, a little background. Where did you grow up? How did you, where did you go to school? I know you have several accolades, and we'll be putting all the references at the bottom of this conversation. But a little bit about your personal life and, how you got into becoming who you are, this authority on mushrooms.
Well, thank you for that very generous opening. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, Columbiana, Ohio, outside of Youngstown, very conservative town, a dry town, if you know what that means, with no alcohol served, except at the veterinary club, the Vets Club. I grew up in a scientific family. I was the youngest one of 5 kids. I adored my brother John. He was my eldest brother, 7 years apart, and John went on to Yale, and so John was a serious scientist. In our basement, we had 3 or 4 rows of chemicals. My dad served on the aircraft carrier, the Intrepid. So we got the Intrepid aircraft carrier radio, the main radio for the aircraft carrier after World War II was in our basement. So my brother John was running all these serious experiments in chemistry, and he let me kind of play in the corner because I was younger, and I would tune into all these things, coded messages from behind the Iron Curtain. I strung a 200-foot long wave antenna with glass insulators in order to pick up long-range signals, and I was just fascinated, and I just lived in his shadow. And he went to Colombia and South America and Mexico and came back with these amazing stories of psilocybin mushrooms, and I was just blown away. And he lent me a book called Altered States of Consciousness. It was one of his textbooks. You may actually remember that book, Deepak, by Charles Tart.
Yeah, I do.
It was a seminal book at the time because it was, and also speak to Andrew Weil, our dear friend. He wrote a book called The Natural Mind. But
yes,
those 2 books were like kind of 2 pistons in the engine in exciting me. But the Altered States of Consciousness, my brother John lent it to me, and I voraciously read it. My friend Ryan, who was my best friend, he borrowed it, and I said, okay, you have to give it back. My brother John's going back to college, and he needs it. It's one of his textbooks. And Ryan said, no problem. I'll give it back to you in a few days. And a few days passed. He didn't give it back to me, and more days passed. And my brother John was pressuring me to return his textbook. And I finally just came to Ryan, and I said, Ryan, I got to have this textbook back. My brother wants it. And he goes, I can't give it to you. And I said, why? And he says, my father found it and burned it. I said, your father burned my brother's book? I was in disbelief because his father was a very authoritarian, far right, conservative, didn't want his kids changing their consciousness for some unreasonable fear. So when that occurred, I was very upset, and I was so ashamed. My brother John was so disappointed in me because he entrusted me with this. But I like to take lemon and make it into lemonade. And I thought, if this was a causal thing to make Ryan's father burn my book, then I think I've found a subject matter I really want to pursue. So that's basically. And I grew up in a very scientific family. My brother went on to Cornell, where my dad went to. My sister, also went to college, and my twin brother and I went to a prep school called the Mercier Academy, and we got kicked out for marijuana, which was probably one of the best things that ever happened in my life as well. So I ended up in Washington State. I worked in the woods for 3 or 4 years, and then I went to the Evergreen State College, and I was fascinated with scanning electron microscopy, and I was living up in the mountains, and I was self-taught on the taxonomy of mushrooms. I tried to find psilocybin mushrooms. It was very difficult to find, but I immersed myself into the science of mycology, the study of fungi. And then I started writing taxonomic keys. These are binary keys, that describe a mushroom, black spores, non-black spores, as you go down this decision tree. And I wrote some taxonomic keys to the genus Psilocybe, which contains the majority of the psilocybin mushrooms. It's important to note there's 116 known species of mushrooms that contain psilocybin. 116. It crosses continents, across cultures. They're really hiding in nature in every continent on this planet. And so, I think people tuned into the ecosystem eventually discover these, and the mushrooms discover the people. I think that's probably more likely that way. So anyhow, that's a short history.
Very, very enlightening. My very special guest is Paul Stamets. He is the foremost authority on mushrooms and mycology, including taxonomy. I'm holding in my hands a number of papers from scientific reports published in various peer-reviewed journals, but some of them very recent. And Paul has become the leading authority on all things mushroom. So let me share a little bit about my history, Paul, and then I want your comments, and I have some notes about what we can also discuss as this conversation goes along. So my first experience with anything psychedelic was the year 1972. I entered medical school in 1964, so it was 1966. And the experience was with LSD. We had Harvard professors visiting our medical school in India, which was funded amongst other institutions by the Rockefeller Foundation at that time. And there were 4 medical students visiting from Harvard, including their professor. And remember, this is before 1969, before the Beatles went to visit Maharishi and all that. But the word was out that there was interesting experimentation going on with psychedelics. So I was one of 4 people recruited from my class in Indians, along with the 4 Americans. And we went through 2 experiences. The first one was very scary to me. I lost my moorings and I lost my so-called identity. Deepak couldn't figure out who I was. But then the second experience, we were all looking at a poster or several pieces of art. But one of the posters I was looking at was Mother Teresa kissing children with leprosy. And the myth at that time was that when she lovingly kissed children who had leprosy, their wounds would heal. I can understand how that could have happened, but that was the prevailing conversation, that this deep compassion that she had would cure people. So I was looking at this poster for almost 8 hours, and it was filled me with a kind of compassion that I never lost, and it influenced everything: medical school, and then coming to the United States, internship, residency, on and on. And so that was a very seminal experience, as you obviously, being the authority, LSD is described is ultimately comes from a mushroom, even though it's synthetic. And then, many years went by. I had never felt the need to explore anything until recently. I became very close to a neuropsychiatrist from Oxford in England who lives in New York, and she's Indian origin, British Indian. And she's become a bit of an authority here at the local medical schools on assisted therapy, including with, right now with ketamine, but of course, everyone has access to psilocybin right now. And so I've been sitting with her as she takes people through sessions and guided meditation before, and after the experience, including with psilocybin. And my interest is, as you know, only consciousness. That's all I'm obsessed with for the last 40 years, including the hard problem of consciousness and why we think it's a wrong approach. I've talked to Michael Pollan. Now I'm privileged to talk to you. And of course, I've also sat with Geeta Vade, that's her name, sitting with people going through the last phases of their life. So recently we sat with one of my agents, who had been my agent for 35 years, 40 years. She also was the agent for Bishop Tutu, a very well-known person in the publishing industry. And she was in her terminal stage with brain cancer. We sat with her, took her through a session, and she had what we call in our medical world terminal lucidity, extreme joy, and had the most peaceful transition a week later. So I have many, many questions for you, but let's start with what interests me most. What interests me most, and I know your work is totally science-based, and I have had my own struggles with the scientific paradigm, which catches on much later. But I come from a wisdom tradition where consciousness is fundamental, and consciousness is pure before it gets modified into what we call states of mind, including this experience we are having right now. And intuitively, I felt that these substances, these medicines, they somehow erased the editing of the conditioned mind. And now we're seeing all this, with the default mode network and all the other benefits that you so eloquently talk about. But tell me one thing, is this what is happening? Are we removing the editing of the conditioned mind that goes back thousands of years in human history and actually entering a domain of awareness, which is so pure, which is timeless, which is incomprehensible because it's infinite, and yet it is the fundamental reality, and everything else is a modified form of that? Just answer this question for me, and then I have lots of other questions.
Well, that's so parallel. And for those of you listening who have not done a deep journey with psilocybin, for instance, which is what I specialize in, the words ineffable, indescribable, these are not just words that are thrown around lightly. It's our struggle to create a language to explain what we experience. My recent experience with psilocybin, and I only do psilocybin once or twice a year. I oftentimes wonder why I don't do it more often. But for people out there who don't know, the psychedelics are non-addictive. In fact, they're anti-addictive by nature. The next day after you look at the mushrooms, most people say, no way, I won't touch that for a long time. But my recent experiences, and these are also experiences that affected me deeply personally from the very beginning. I had an extraordinarily bad stuttering habit. If you have seen the movie The King's Speech, I was worse than that. And my psilocybin experience taught me to love myself. And if you love yourself, then everything else is easier. Because I know fundamentally I'm a good person. I also know fundamentally people are good. It's there's a unanimity of goodness as a bridge across all peoples, I believe. So from my experiences, the latest experience I had, this one word came to me and it was really powerful. It was existence. We always exist in different forms. And these high doses of psilocybin, you realize that everything is talking, everything is communicating. And the experiences I've had called me out, and probably you as well, and many others, to now that you're aware, you have a responsibility to the planet. You have a responsibility to all living creatures, even inanimate objects, to walk a path of dignity and caring and loving. And I believe we all are part of one giant consciousness. And this is something that it has come to me that so powerfully is that, and I feel better about my own mortality, realizing that from this organic matter I sprung, into which I return. It gives me a great solace that I'm just on this journey, and the human existence is one episode, one chapter in an exhaustive, endless book of experiences of existence. So I feel like, we have to be careful because you don't want to become messianic about this, because there's a lot of pitfalls associated with that. I've always learned, Deepak, as soon as your ego goes up, nature comes around, slaps you back. So I'm going to be careful, but I feel like I am a thought leader. I'm one of many generations throughout thousands of years, and we need to pass this knowledge forward. How do we do that? In the rituals, and I'm really happy to hear of your LSD experience, because you had a processing, pre-processing, post-processing, analysis and structure. Many indigenous societies and cultures have these structures in place. Us displaced, in a sense, peoples who migrate all over the world. And by the way, when we migrate, we take our ancestral knowledge, we carry it forward. So dissemination of sacraments and knowledge of sacraments is part of our path. You meet somebody on a remote trail going over the mountain range, and they're friend or foe. If they're friend, you exchange items and knowledge that are useful in friendship. So I see that there's a zeitgeist of our time is psilocybin. I feel that we face an enormous climate crisis and chaos. I believe psilocybin makes nicer people, smarter people. There are multiple meta studies that I like speaking about that have been reported that shows one psilocybin experience is statistically significantly related to a reduction in partner-to-partner violence, a reduction in crime, larceny, theft, burglary, and other crimes. And now with a large meta study, I think 200,000 people, there was only one psychedelic associated with a reduction of opioid use disorder. Only one, not LSD, not MDMA, not ketamine, psilocybin. So I think psilocybin offers a way of creating new neural pathways, neurogenesis. And that's what so much of my work has been focused on recently, is on microdosing. And we have excellent examples of neurogenic activity. There's neurogenesis in the hippocampus. Newborn stem cells become neurons. There's neurogeneration, which causes nerves to generate. There's neuroregenerations when nerves are atrophying and then are stimulated into regrowth. And there's neuroplasticity, or synaptogenesis, which causes these brain networks to better crosstalk to each other. We're seeing evidence across all of those. And I want to speak to something that's practical to people, because if we speak in the ethereal, in the spiritual, always, how is it rooted or mycelially or, rooted, into a reality of actionable solutions? And what we discovered, we published in 2 papers that you held up in Nature on microdosing.
I have the papers. Yeah, right. There's amazing stuff.
And they're in the top 99.9% of all papers ever published in the Nature publication ecosystem. For those who have, the Nature is a big deal for a scientist. Only 7% of the articles get submitted to get published approximately. And what we found that was so extraordinary, of course, is the reduction in anxiety and depression from microdosing. The most popular, now, what is a microdose? Maybe I should define these terms. Microdose has been typically subsensorium. That means below the sense, below your senses, but it's really not quite that. It's about 1/10 of a liftoff dose. So with psilocybe cubensis, it could be 1 gram as a liftoff dose, 1/10 of a gram. You're not intoxicated. Colors are a little bit brighter. You're in a better mood. So that's basically defines a microdose. And so we did this large study with quantified citizens at microdose.me. Anyone can sign up for the Droid or the Apple device. We have over 20,000 people now reporting. So we started doing, the first study was qualitative, what people, why they microdose, is it increasing in intelligence, fighting depression was the biggest one, of course, and anxiety. And who doesn't have anxiety and depression in these challenging times? But then we also narrowed down to something that we want to look at psychomotor benefits, because the expectancy of taking a mushroom and hoping you become less depressed, there's an expectancy factor. And so people expect the medicine to reduce depression. And so how do you disambiguate cause and effect versus expectancy of the medicine? But we had one, it's called the tap test. Anybody can do this. How many times can you tap your 2 fingers in 10 seconds? Well, there's a sad fact of life, folks. We all suffer from neurodegeneration and age. And Deepak, I have a vested interest in your wisdom, being, to the very end of your life, being on the top of your game, and many other, wise people. It's the tragedy of aging that we lose encyclopedic knowledge not to pass on to the next generation. So the body intellectual knowledge that we need to preserve for humanity is so critical for fighting climate change, for overcoming wars, for developing better relationships, et cetera, et cetera. So the TAP test is a psychomotor test. And I popularized a stack, and a stack is a combination of psilocybin with lion's mane and niacin. And I came up with this in 2014, 2015. And because I mentioned that it's called the Stamets stack, I just call it the stack, but it's known as the Stamets stack. And so in our survey, we asked how many people are stacking, how many people are doing the Stamets stack. And I think 58% of the people who are stacking are using this combination of lion's mane. It's the mycelium, by the way, not the fruit bodies. Big difference. The mycelium augments neurogenesis. The fruit bodies do not. So make sure it's mycelium of lion's mane, niacin, nicotinic acid, the flushing form, not the non-flushing form, and then a microdose of psilocybin. Well, extraordinary result occurred. I've got 7 or 8 co-authors, 3 statisticians, and they literally called me up and said, we see something, but we don't want to tell you until we reanalyze this data with 3 different analytical methods, and it held up true. And what we found was simply this. With 55-plus-year-olds, there was an increase in the psychomotor skills of tapping from about 48 taps in 10 seconds to 69 after 30 days using the Stamets stack. With psilocybin alone or with any other form, no significance, no signal at all. So now people want to know, well, why did I come up with this combination? Well, I did it for multiple reasons. I suspected that psilocybin causes neurogenesis. And I knew psilocybin made nicer people. It made me a nicer person. And a lot of people I know are much nicer post a big psilocybin trip. So I think this is, and the data supports this. But I knew that lion's mane causes remyelination on the axons of nerves. Many studies have come out on that. There's 4 clinical studies. I populate a website called mushroomreferences.com, unbranded, just for physicians and scientists, mushroomreferences.com. You can find those clinical studies there. So remyelination on the axons of nerves helps your signal transmission. Neurogenesis is what I suspected with psilocybin, even though it had not been reported. And then I used a nicotinic acid, the flushing form of niacin, because psilocybin is a vasoconstrictor. Psilocybin and niacin is a vasodilator. So I thought the larger the vessels, the more conduit of nutrients, neuronutrients coming through. And also, neuropathies oftentimes present themselves as a deadening of the fingertips and toes. So I thought the vascular system could be improved, and neuropathies, present themselves as a deadening of the peripheral nervous system. And niacin causes you to itch and flush, and all your nerve endings are excited. I thought, well, that'd be great. And also for the reason as an aversive. How are you going to microdosing across the counter? Everybody would like to macrodose, or a lot of people would. So by adding niacin, if you haven't done 400 milligrams, 500 milligrams of niacin, try it. In 20 minutes, you'll start itching. And the idea would be,
as a physician, I've seen that.
yeah, you've seen that. So
Yeah.
that combination is why I came up with that. And lo and behold, the significance that we found in the TAP test using the stack, the p-value of significance is 0.004. Now, to put this in context, at 0.05, there's 5 chances out of 100. It would be just random. A 0.004 is 1 chance out of 250 that this could be a false signal or a random signal. So I believe we have now evidence, preliminarily, it has to be proven in clinical studies. Let me be clear about that. But now we have the cellular evidence with neuroreceptors called MAP kinases. These are proteins which are receptors, and if you activate these, then it causes neurogenesis. So we have massive results. We have over 200 examples of synergy, and so people may not know what synergy is. If you have 1x of one compound, 1x of another compound, you put them together, your expected would be 2x. Well, we have 0 of one compound with these neuroreceptors, 0 with one compound, 0 with another compound in the stack. The activity is massive. So 0 plus 0 plus 0 equals 50 or 100. It's called synergy. That's why gunpowder.
Biosynergy, yeah. Biosynergy, yeah.
Yeah, so this is what I think I've really discovered, something that is evidence preliminarily, again, has to be proven in clinical studies, but very strong evidence, not only with the MAP kinases, these neuroreceptors, the neurites we grow in the petri dishes of neurons, brain neurons, we can see the activity increasing. And then the physical psychomotor test, we have 3 pearls on the string of evidence that is leading to, looks like psilocybin mushrooms with lion's mane and niacin causes neurogenesis. And think about how many people could be saved from not falling. And when they're older, better psychomotor skills. I think about how many guitar players or piano players can be digitally agile. That's directly related to the TAP test. And I think it's potentially a game changer. I think niacin is a catalyst for many of these compounds that affect neurological health. And ironically, if you go to clinicaltrials.gov right now, type in psilocybin, there's 100 clinical studies that have been registered at clinicaltrials.gov. 11 of them use niacin opposite psilocybin as a positive control. They totally teach away from my invention. Why did they choose niacin? Because in 20 minutes they feel something. But I want to pose to you as a physician, is it ethical to trick people with a placebo in treating their depression when in 20 minutes they're hot and they're red and they're itching and they know they got niacin? Doesn't that distort the data set because people become more depressed because they're hoping to get psilocybin and they got the placebo? And so when they measure the effects of depression against the baseline, the placebo, they're actually exacerbating the differential. That's a rhetorical question. That's from one scientist to another physician. So it's interesting to me that other people have not picked up on this, but rapidly so. We have now, 3 papers, 2 published, actually 3 published now in Nature, 2 on the TAP test. And I refer any physicians out there to look into this, because it's how could you have a placebo that's specific for 55-plus-year-olds that increases psychomotor benefits? I looked it up. There's 6 regions of the brain that are involved in tapping your 2 fingers. It's amazing. You have ideation, you have sight, you have feedback loop, you have the coordination, you have the cadence. It's extraordinarily complicated. It's amazing that humans even exist. We start looking at how much of these neural networks are involved for just doing the simplest of things. So this is what we're really excited about. We're planning our first clinical studies will be on Parkinson's, for which there's really no treatment. And then, of course, Alzheimer's, dementia, traumatic brain injuries, all of these use the TAP test as a standard test for measuring neuropathies and neurological decline or recovery. Many people with traumatic brain injuries, the TAP test scores go down initially and they come back up. With Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, dementia, unfortunately, the slope is straight down. And so we think we have something here that's really a game changer.
I'm speaking to Paul Stamets, and all the references that he cited, the papers, the links will be here below this conversation. We'll make sure you have access to all the information that Paul is mentioning. So as you were speaking, by the way, about love and being nicer, if in the ultimate reality, we're all so inseparable, then love becomes the ultimate experience of unity consciousness. The Indian poet Tagore used to say, love is not a mere sentiment, it is the ultimate truth at the heart of creation. And so, you're paving the way, actually, scientifically, to say that love heals. And now we know that, the opposite of love, whatever we want to call it, fear, anger, hostility, guilt, shame, depression, does the opposite. Inflammation. We've done several studies through our foundation, even during the COVID pandemic, where those who were getting sick and those who were succumbing to disease, even the elderly, younger people, all had inflammation, depression, anxiety, and frequently didn't even know what their source of anxiety was. And yet the anxiety and stress was making them succumb to these inflammatory storms, that were getting these people into trouble. So here is my question to you. You've given us a lot of information, and I have it here on neuroplasticity, neuropathy, inflammation, healing, chronic illness, depression, mood changes, all of that. And we're going to make sure that people have access to that. I have some existential questions as well, because, in my Indian tradition, we go through 4 phases of existence. First 25 years education, second 25 years fame and fortune, third 25 years giving back. Now I'm going to be 76 in a couple of months. This is the time when we figure out what's going on, what's reality, what's the nature of the self. So as I've been exploring this in my own world with my own little, curiosity, I'm going to ask you a question, and let's not risk being blasphemous. But, in India, in the hymns of the Rig Veda, there are 2 chapters devoted to Soma. Soma is the elixir of immortality. And people are always trying to figure out what the Soma is. In fact, as a side note, when my father passed away and we were taking his ashes to the Ganges, my brother and I were in the cab that was going up to the mountains. And my brother at that time was the dean of education at Harvard Medical School. He's younger to me by 3 years. And as we were going up the Ganges, we saw these sadhus, and they were in what we call samadhi, transcendence. So my brother asked our driver, he said, "What are they smoking?" He said, "Ganja, sir, ganja." So my brother said, "Can we get some?" And the taxi driver said, "No, sir, you have to be enlightened." So with that introduction, you look at Soma in the Rig Veda and the hymns that are sung to this, whatever the substance is, but it tells in esoteric, poetic language, everything that I have here as a reference from you. Everything that you have, it says so in poetry and in song and in verse. But then I started to think, the manna that dropped from heaven and Moses fed the manna to his Israelites. Was that fungus? When Jesus converted water into wine, did the wine casks have fungus inside them? And this is not a blasphemous query, because what these substances are doing are probably returning us to our primal state of being or existence. And you said, we've had existence in many forms. Right now in my body, I can't even move my fingers or speak to you without the help of the genetic information of all my ancestors, and human ancestors, animal ancestors, microbial ancestors, all the way back to the neural networks that your friend Suzanne Simard talks about, the mother tree. So can you respond to my query?
Well, you're asking a question that may not ever have a concrete answer because it's all hypothetical and speculative. But you touched upon something that many of us experts, when you have such an accumulation of symbols and legends and uses, it speaks to the same narrative. Now, because this medicine is so powerful in changing people's minds, that's what I told Michael Pollan, by the way, psilocybin mushrooms changed my mind. And because it's a disruptor to conventional wisdom, then it'd be natural for the teachers to guard these secrets in order to protect them. So they're cloaked in poetry and symbolism and folklore without revealing everything. But those you have gone to Islamic mosques, the shape of the windows are taxonomically perfect for a psilocybin mushroom. I went to Cappadocia in the Byzantine era, and the post the death of Christ, the 2nd and 3rd century, 4th century. And I was being led by a guide, and I said, "What do you think about all these mushroom symbols all over these caves?" And he goes, "What mushroom symbols?" And I pointed out 20 of them, and he looked like deer in headlights. He just suddenly lit up. There's numerous examples throughout the world. The manna from heaven, the soma, all of these things. Well, that's interesting. It's fun to speculate, but the here and now, we can document this in concrete evidence. So that's not us trying to interpret the past and to get into a quagmire of dissenters and trolls and people who argue that it's not possible. Let's argue about what we can see as evidence today. Over 100 clinical trials going on psilocybin, approved by IRB boards, institutional review boards, that are vetted by scientists and physicians, and they're only approved if there is an urgent need, some promise of treating these illnesses, and low toxicity and availability. And psilocybin, every box there is checked. So, I mean, I could talk for hours about the speculation throughout history, but since the dawn of humanity, psilocybin, it looks like it evolved about 20 million years ago when it first appeared. But the psilocybin mushrooms have a unique habit of being trail followers. They follow the activities of humans. Now, I'm in this remote island in British Columbia, and I spent a lot of time in the old growth forest. Psilocybin mushrooms are extremely rare. There's only one species, Psilocybe pelliculosa, that I found in the old growth forest. But when you take alder trees and you chip them, then suddenly these psilocybin mushrooms come up in the wood chips. So with the advent of beauty bark landscaping around buildings in the 1960s and 70s, when I was working with Dr. Daniel Stuntz at the University of Washington, he had never seen these psilocybin mushrooms. And so these students were bringing them in all the time because they were growing the wood chips around the university buildings. And so that's really interesting to me, is that these psilocybin mushrooms follow human activities. And I think they're following human activity for a purposeful reason. Now, this is, I'll be out there, but I do believe this is true. They're coming into play right now, and they're so important at a time critical where we must evolve. We are no longer the Homo sapiens of the past 200,000 years, and we damn well better not be. It's time for us to evolve to a higher state of being. And so I propose Homo ascendus. We need to ascend to a higher state of consciousness. 200,000 years for a species is a very short time period. And suddenly the human brain expanded at a time of climate change and migration. there's no doubt we all came from Africa. I don't think there's a serious critic out there that can dispute that. And as we migrated, we carried the knowledge of psilocybin mushrooms, and peoples all over the world discovered these mushrooms. And when they have this experience, it is so transformative. Now, psilocybin mushrooms, flies land on them and eggs are laid and larvae grow. Well, there's 23 primates that are known to eat mushrooms. And these primates also eat larvae. So mushrooms being fleshy, and the Psilocybin cubensis growing in India, you can see it hundreds of feet away. And so I'm going back to your Indian roots, several things that I think is really interesting is the cows are sacred. Well, you don't want to kill the mother that's giving you the sacrament, right? So that's interesting to me. Krishna being blue, the blue in the psilocybin, soma, and it's well reported that Buddha died from eating a mushroom. So I had a Buddhist priest tell me he went into a heightened state of consciousness purposely by ingesting the mushroom.
And his last statement, when he was asked, who are you? Are you a prophet? Are you a god? Are you a messiah, messenger? He said, none of the above. He said, who are you? He said, I'm awake. I'm awake. That was his last statement. Totally fitting what you're saying.
Wow.
Yeah, that was his final statement. They asked him, are you God? Are you divine? Are you messenger, Messiah? He said, none of the above. He said, well, tell us who you are. He said, I'm awake. That was his last sentence.
And that's what I think that we have an awakening of our consciousness, that we realize we're part of a much bigger.
And what you're calling the awakening to the next species, I've been calling that metahuman, going beyond the ordinary conditioned mind that we call human. We need to wake up to that metahuman where we see the inseparability of existence. So, we can't go over a certain time limit for social media because we have to go everywhere. We will be publishing all this, the references and how to get to your various websites and so on. Now, coming from this amazing conversation to the mundane, I see a lot of patients with neuropathy. Some of them have neuropathy as a result of chemotherapy, or, they're taking tamoxifen or something like that. But, there are many, many medical drugs that are toxic that cause neuropathy. I'm also seeing all this new information on nicotinamide mononucleotide and these so-called what are they called? Signal molecules that extend lifespan. Do you think there's a role for psilocybin in not only treatment of neuropathy, but also life extension, along with other lifestyle measures, such as good sleep, healthy emotions, and so on? And lastly, how can we here, I have appointments now in several medical schools, University of California, San Diego, Mount Sinai here, University of Central Florida. How can we help promote your work? Not that you need more work to do, but this is so important. And in a way, you've also suggested that what the role that mushrooms play would facilitate the next evolutionary leap of humans, metahuman or ascendist, whatever you call it. And there was a final question, and that was on mechanism. Does serotonin have anything to do with this, or is entirely a different mechanism? And I'll stop there because we must finish in about 5 minutes.
You asked me 3 questions that take me an hour to.
Yeah, I know. You're a walking encyclopedia.
But let me try to go through this quickly as possible. It's unfortunate that the 100 studies and the many studies that have been published on psilocybin are on psilocybin, the molecule, where 99.9%, not an exaggeration, of people using psilocybin is in the mushroom form. We have found the psilocybin analogs have extraordinarily powerful anti-inflammatory properties in stimulating what's called interleukin 10 and interleukin 1RA. These are anti-inflammatory cytokines. So not only promotes neurogenesis, but it's bundled with a neuro anti-inflammatory. That's medically, as you know, unique to have cell division that it buffers down inflammation. So many physicians, University of Arizona Medical School, Dr. Andrew Weil, et cetera, are strong supporters of my work. I don't make medical recommendations, but you should absolutely source a supply of lion's mane from a certified organic, preferably US sourced facility. We have a host defense product line. It's at fungi.com. That is what is over 60% of the people in the Nature study. That is the most popular lion's mane product that's out there. So logically, it seems to be connected. Again, we don't know, and I'm not a medical doctor, so I can't make recommendations. But we're at an opportunity now with neuro anti-inflammatories, neuro regeneration, that this could be bundled in and further stacked with other conventional medicines. Because I don't think that it's going to be one size fits all. I think that looking at the receptor landscapes in the ecosystem by activating synergistic responses that are buffering inflammation, but promoting neurogenesis in conjunction with other medicines that can help. I think that's the best path. And much of our research is going that direction.
The comment on serotonin?
Pardon?
Does it increase the activity of serotonin receptors?
Psilocybin is a serotonin agonist.
Yeah.
So it substitutes.
Yeah.
But the reason why many of us think that macrodosing and microdosing are a nice pairing, because when you have a macrodose, you think differently, you have new neurological pathways. But then if you chase that with microdosing, you revisit those same new neurological pathways, you reinforce them. Dr. Roland Griffith's seminal study from 1999, 14 months later, the act of remembering the experience was therapeutically beneficial. Now, your memories are revisiting neurological pathways. And so the remembering of a positive experience was therapeutically beneficial. That's extraordinary. And when you're facing an immunological distress, we know that, as you speak to this, when you're happier, your immune system is at a better state of readiness. When you are depressed, you are literally immunologically depressed. And so if you can wake up the day excited and sharing with your family and being creative and artistic, you have optimism in this mind over matter that you and Dr. Andrew Weil speak so eloquently about. So I think this is potentially a game changer across a wide field of medicine to help people potentiate and to recalibrate, in a sense. It was not thought that adults, could grow new neurons, in the hippocampus related to BDNF, brain-derived neurofactors. Now we know we can. So I think this is a potentially game changer in medicine. Wouldn't it be wonderful if all of our elders at the very end of their life were intellectually intact to be able to pass the torch to the next generation? How much knowledge is lost when every elder dies that suffers from neuropathy and dementia? Think of the tragedy of the commons. And so I think all of us being thought leaders, and all of us listening are thought leaders, is so important to be able to carry our knowledge forward with dignity, courage, and kindness and love. And I really believe that when you open up your heart and you share love, you share kindness, you do things not as a transactional exchange of what is my benefit. By benefiting the commons, everyone benefits. And I think this is a game changer, again, at a time critical where we need to have a paradigm shifting solution. I think psilocybin could be the catalyst for that.
My very special guest has been Paul Stamets, and we'll be talking about psilocybin, mushrooms, healing, anti-inflammatory effects, terminal lucidity, neurogenesis, and the future evolution of the human species. Just as an ending, I trained under a person called Seymour Reichland, and this is in the 70s. We were looking at opiates and receptors in the brain, and he's now 97. He's a neighbor to Andrew Weil, but he visits New York frequently and actually teaches at NYU when he can. 97, still find, if he finds a snake in his garden, he'll look for receptors and all that, and still argues with me about the hard problem of consciousness. So, Paul, this has been an amazing conversation. We'll put all the links, and I thank you so much for your contribution to science, your contribution to humanity, and your contribution to the alleviation of suffering in this world. So very grateful to you, and count me as your ally in your future endeavors.